Hello. Good morning. I am back with more of Margot Nash's The Politics of Murder. Okay. Yesterday, I stopped at chapter 22. This book is banana sandwich. Okay. I will start by saying, if you have not listened to any of the chapters up until this point, don't listen now. Go back to my list of my whatever. I can't remember the words. MS takes my words, but I have a whole thing of all of these, okay? And start at the beginning. I have a whole list. Go to the Politics of Murder playlist. There it is, playlist. Start at the beginning and click play all, and you'll hear the entire book right up until this point. By then, maybe I'll be done a couple more chapters, and you can continue listening. We're about to start chapter 23, FUBAR. This book is FUBAR. FUBAR, all y'all that don't know what FUBAR stands for, fucked up beyond all relief, beyond all recognition. That's what FUBAR means. At least to us here in corrupted Massachusetts. And don't think I don't have a coffee. Caramel something delightful. I shouldn't be drinking it, but I'm probably going to have about 12. This is what we got right here. Oh my God. See, this is what this book has done to me. This is what this book has done to me. I have to have like fancy, indulgent coffees. This book is no joke, okay? And I did put the light on because it's a little overcast in Massachusetts. It has been for a long time. Overcast with bullshit, overcast with corruption, overcast with garbage. Let's get right into it, shall we? Chapter 23, FUBAR. The sixth day of the trial started off with long lobby conference between the judge and the attorneys. Judge McDaniel had read in the newspaper that he was about to exclude the newspaper page that morning. I don't like doing that. I don't like reading in the paper what I'm going to do. George first denied, then admitted to talking to the Herald's Ann Donlan and apologized. McDaniel then said that since George had told him Eddie would be testifying on his own behalf, that it really didn't matter whether the exhibit was excluded or not. George backpedaled, saying that they weren't yet sure whether or not Eddie would testify. Peter Seltzer, an attorney working with George, gave an eloquent argument about how the issue had become so much larger than just the admission of the newspaper, now that McDaniel had allowed the article to be read to the jury. He asked that the court not only strike the exhibit, but strike all of David Otte's testimony about the exhibit as well. McDaniel agreed that if he struck the exhibit, he would strike all the testimony. He then requested a magnifying glass to see if he could read the article from the photograph itself. He determined that he could, with difficulty, read some of it. He told the attorneys that if the jury asked for the magnifying glass, that he would provide them with one. He believed that they would be able to read the article from the photograph, and the argument to exclude the newspaper page itself was becoming less compelling to him. Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm reading a book. If you haven't followed me up until this point, go back to my playlist, find right here, The Politics of Murder, and start from the beginning so you can hear the whole book. And thank you. Lovely compliment. You have a lovely, lovely day. And seriously, listen to this whole book. Don't just start from this chapter. I'm on chapter 23. Go back and listen to the whole book. It's amazing. Riley had already filed a motion to preserve Exhibit 73, the newspaper front page, with an accompanying memorandum of law citing cases and reasons why the front page should come into evidence. He argued in the alternative that the entire newspaper, which George offered at the beginning of Otte's testimony, be submitted for the single page. George should have explained that he only proposed to admit the entire newspaper when he believed the front page that was going in came from Eddie's room. He should have renewed his motion for a mistrial. He never did. He did neither. All he said was that he wasn't able to read the article in the photograph with the magnifying glass. Ultimately, the judge decided to reserve his ruling regarding the newspaper in order to review Riley's motion, his memorandum first. He ordered the trial to proceed. Otte continued to testify under George's cross-examination about the speech on July 25, 1995, noting that Eddie's room was searched at approximately 7:30 that evening. There were approximately 5 others with him, but only 2 or 3 with him in the bedroom. He couldn't recall if the photographer went in before or after him. George asked him to testify about the many sports trading cards found in the room, on the floor, and in the other spaces. Didn't that show that collecting and trading sports cards was on Eddie's mind during that time period? He returned to the newspaper, and Otte testified that the 2 photographs George showed him indicated that the entire newspaper, not just the front page, was on top of the bureau. The disaster of the prior day's testimony was somewhat minimized as George went through all of the other things in Eddie's room that reflected Eddie's state of mind on July 25th, 1995. An astronomy book and a telescope, sports trading cards, photographs of friends and family, a Celtics jersey hung up on the wall, barbells, a baseball glove, religious photographs, and even more newspapers under Eddie's bed. Each time he asked Otte whether or not these things also reflected what was on Eddie's mind on July 25th, 1995. Each time he made the point that the newspaper was not the only thing on Eddie's mind. It mitigated some of the damage. George picked up his copy of the entire newspaper and walked to the sidebar. The sidebar. You're really cute. I'm not going to anyone's party. You're sweet. I'm reading today. That's what I'm doing today. Happy Veterans Day, by the way, if you're a veteran. Today is Veterans Day, and it's also Singles Day. I happen to be single. I'm enjoying the day, celebrating, reading my book. You enjoy the day. Have a lovely party. And thank you for the invite, but I'm going to politely decline as I'm reading my book today. But have fun. George didn't want it marked into evidence. All right, where'd I go? It is marked for evidence. It is marked for identification so that the attorney can refer to it and have the witnesses testify about it. The witness cannot read from it or quote from it because it is not yet in evidence. George did not want it marked into evidence because he was objecting to Riley admitting it to evidence. George handed Otte the newspaper and asked if he could identify it. Otte testified that it appeared to be a copy of the same paper he saw in Eddie's bedroom. George said, "I offer this, Your Honor." The judge responded, "Exhibit 84. George had apparently forgotten that he was supposed to ask that it be marked for identification only. Instead, he just had the exhibit he was seeking to exclude from evidence marked into evidence. He did nothing to correct the record. Wow, this guy's a baboon. Excuse me. Hi, Tiara. Pardon me. It's coffee time. Oh, that's better. You don't know my daughter, Love Bug. Tiara, that's nice. She actually is not. She's working. You're cute. Okay, so here we go. Where'd it go? Yeah, this guy is a complete. He's a baboon. He's not a very good lawyer. This guy. He did nothing to correct the record. He continued with his examination of the trooper. Then he caught himself and partially fixed the problem by asking that the newspaper be a chalk, something used to illustrate testimony instead. The newspaper was clearly not a chalk as defined legally. It's not a chart or a drawing or a model of the newspaper. It's the actual newspaper. Nothing in the record explains why George didn't just mark it for identification as they had agreed to do so. The larger question is why George continued to inquire about the newspaper with this witness. When McDaniel decided the trial would continue, notwithstanding the fact that he hadn't ruled on Exhibit 73, George could have asked for permission to continue. his cross-examination, after the judge made his ruling. If the exhibit was excluded, then there would be no need to refer to it further. If it was kept in evidence, he could have asked the questions he thought were necessary later. Why didn't he do this? Why indeed didn't he do this? Why indeed? He didn't. He's just not a good lawyer. The dude took all her money and did nothing that he was supposed to do. It made no practical or legal sense for George to question the witness further about an exhibit that he had moved to be stricken from the record. There was nothing to gain from this questioning. Technically, he couldn't ask Otti to read from a chalk newspaper, but that was precisely what he did. George was focused on letting the jury know that Eddie had the newspaper in his room because it contained notices for sports card shows in the area. Eddie went to these shows frequently to buy or trade cards or to have cards autographed. George directed Otti to the classified section in the back of the paper, but there was nothing Otti could read that would untangle the knot that this witness had caused by reading the Natural Born Killers article. The jury was never going to forget those words about the thrill of stabbing someone. They were never going to forget that Otti kept trying to tell George that he never seized the newspaper from the bedroom, while George seemingly ignored his testimony and grilled him about throwing the paper away. George continued to compound his problems with this exhibit at every possible turn. Clearly, George is just not a smart man. How this guy is an attorney blows my mind. George needed to cut his losses and try to regroup, reserving the right to recall Otti after the court ruled on the newspaper's admissibility. This witness and the evidence had become what military personnel call FUBAR, fucked up beyond all recognition. There you go. There you go. That's what I said. I can't. This guy is an idiot. How do idiots become lawyers? How is that possible? I don't understand that. Like, he was paid thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars to represent this boy, and he just dropped the ball at every stage. Now we're on chapter 24, Eddie O'Brien's Friends. Craziness. Moving on. Chapter 24, Eddie O'Brien's Friends. It was only 10:30 a.m. when David Otti left the witness stand. Day 6 of the trial would be long and arduous. The next 4 witnesses took up the remainder of the day. Pardon me, I'm going to turn this light on. It's going to help me read better. Turn this up higher. Oh, that's better. Much better. Here we go. Okay. The next 4 witnesses took up the remainder of the day. Eddie's childhood friends, Paul Downing, Joey Dion, Ryan Downing, and Chris Ford. Through these witnesses, Riley intended to show that Eddie was obsessed with Downing in some sexual way that motivated him to murder her. He did not. Those are my words. He did not. There's no way he did. Riley called Paul Downing to the stand. Paul had been the last to see his mother alive and had been taken from the... Remember that. Paul had been the last to see his daughter alive. Craziness. He had been taken from the crime scene. She had been taken from the crime scene to the hospital because he couldn't breathe. I can't. That's so sad. This whole thing, I have to just warn you guys, there's pictures in this book and stuff. If you don't want to see the pictures, just don't. It's not. Once you see these things, you cannot unsee them. So Paul had been the last to see his mother alive and had been taken from the crime scene to the hospital because he couldn't breathe. And then, according to the police reports produced, gave his one and only statement. How do you give just one and only statement after your mother's killed? One and only statement, a single sentence at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, July 26, 1995, the day after Eddie's arrest. Paul was now 19 years old and a sophomore at Suffolk University, studying clinical psychology. 19, God, he was a baby. John Fitzpatrick, Marco Abreu, Eddie O'Brien, Garvey Solomon, Joey Dion, and Seth Dion were at the Downing house on an almost daily basis. All the boys were very respectful toward his mother. and she was cordial to them. Paul said that in the summer of 1994, Eddie O'Brien had called him to say that he was Paul's mother up in Paul's room with a flashlight. Paul explained that his lights go out periodically up there. After that, continually over the years. Eddie commented about his mother. He said that Eddie asked why his mother sat in her car in the driveway smoking cigarettes. In the winter of 1995, Paul remembered that he was changing a light bulb in his mother's room, and the light flickered for several seconds. He said that Eddie called and asked why the light was flickering in his mother's bedroom. Paul told him he was changing the light bulb and that it was 10:30 p.m. and Eddie should be in bed. Riley asked him if he had any other conversations with Eddie about other neighbors. Answer. It was the day after I went over to get Janine. And question. I'm sorry, Your Honor. The day after what? Answer. The day after the story, where we were the week before on a Saturday. I came to get her on a Sunday. Question. In relation to the July 23rd, when did you have this conversation with him? Answer. I said, question, when? Answer. When? Question, yes. Answer. Prior to my mom's murder? Question. How soon prior? Answer. Prior? A week. Question. Okay. Answer. It was that Sunday. Question. The Sunday before your mother died? Answer. Yes. Question. Would you tell us what Edward O'Brien said? Answer. He said to me that one night he was in his bedroom window and he saw the neighbor across the street, a black woman, changing. And he described her, what he could see, the chest area, and he described that she was wearing no clothes except for a bra, and he just pretty much gave me the details of what he saw. Question. What were the details of what he saw? Answer. Exactly? Question. Yes. Answer. He said that he could see her chest and bra? Question. And he said her chest? Answer. He said to me, oh, you should have seen it. You could see her tits. She was wearing a red bra. You should have seen it. Eddie had never told Paul about this event. Paul either heard it from one of the other boys and forgot that fact or altered the story because Eddie was not in his bedroom when this occurred. And he was not alone. Eddie saw this woman undressing while sitting on his front porch with Marco Abreu. Marco and Eddie both saw this woman undress, as Marco confirmed this in his own testimony on cross-examination. Ooh, Paul's making up stories. Paul is making up stories. Crazy. However, Riley was actively trying to create the impression that Eddie sat in his bedroom looking out his window at the neighbors' houses. Not true. Paul testified about a conversation he said he had with Eddie at 6:30 on the night of his mother's murder. This was the first time his story had been told. Even though Paul had testified at the prior transfer hearing, Paul said that he was leaning against his mother's car after Ryan and Joey brought in the groceries, waiting for Janine O'Brien to come out so they could leave for Revere Beach. He said that Eddie came up to him and asked if his mother was okay. Paul said she was and asked why. Eddie told him he'd just seen her sleeping on the couch, on the den couch, and wondered if she was okay. Riley continued. Question. Where did that conversation take place? Answer. I was sitting on my mother's car when I was waiting for Gene to come, and he walked over to me and he said, "What's wrong with your mom?" I said to him, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I walked in the house and I looked to my left and I saw your mom lying down. I could see her head. She's tired." And he said, "Oh." Question. Now who was in the house at that time? Answer. Nobody, just my mom. Bob George tried but failed to catch Paul in several inconsistencies in this new story about his conversation on cross-examination. Question. When was it, the conversation? Answer. It was when they brought in the groceries, I went back in the house to bring in the perishables. Question. Okay. Answer. Janine called. That's about like 5 minutes later. I went back outside. Ryan and them were already gone. Went over to get Janine, went over back to my car. Ed approached me. He asked about my mom. The story, if taken in the context of all the testimony, could not have occurred. But not all of that testimony had yet been heard. This is a challenge that vexes attorneys and jurors alike. It's not possible to tell the whole story of an event in a linear way. Each witness supplies a piece of the puzzle. It was impossible for this conversation to have taken place. Why? Ryan Downing and Joey Dion soon testified that after they put the groceries inside the house, they got a call from Chris Ford and agreed to meet him at the corner of Monroe and Bigelow Streets, 351 feet from the Downing house. Ryan was on rollerblades. They met Chris, who was on a bike, and immediately they came back to 71 Boston Street. Paul was not there. He'd already left for Revere Beach. For Paul's story to be true, the following would all have to have transpired in the time it took Ryan and Joey to skate 1 block, 351 feet up the street, meet Chris, who was on a bike, and skate bike back again. Paul would have had to leave his mother's car, go back into the house, put away the perishables. About 5 minutes later, Paul would have answered a call from Janine O'Brien, arranged to go to Revere Beach. Paul would then have gone back outside, leaned against the car to wait for Janine. After a while, when she didn't come out of her house, Paul would have walked across the street, knocked on Janine's door, told her to hurry up, and returned to lean on the car again to wait for Janine. At this point, Eddie would have had to walk past Paul without Paul seeing him, walk into the house, observe Janet asleep in the den, walk back out, and have the conversation with Paul that he described. Impossible. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Hello. Savim. I hope I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm mangling anyone's name. I always try to do my best with names. Beautiful name. Hello. I'm reading a book. Follow along. If you haven't already followed up until this point, go back. I have a playlist. It is this book, The Politics of Murder. Start at the beginning, hit play all, and enjoy. Because I'm up in the 20s of this book now. You want to hear the whole thing. That is crazy. Paul would have then crossed the street and gotten into Janine's car and driven off for Revere Beach. There's no way this could have happened how he's describing. Because this was the first time that Paul mentioned this conversation, after 2 years and all of his prior testimony, George knew that it was probably fabricated. It could not have happened this way in the time frame Paul said it did. But George was not able to tell the jurors that they were about to hear from other witnesses, what they were about to hear from other witnesses. He could not impeach or show the inconsistency of the statements as compared to the other boys' statements because they had not testified yet. Riley had to know this story was at the very least embellished and at worst entirely fabricated. He was eliciting it. The testimony did not come as a surprise to him. He was encouraging Paul to tell this unlikely story. Riley very well understood that a story about Eddie seeing Janet Downing asleep on the couch while he was with all of his friends did not support his theory. During his opening statement, Riley had told the jurors that they would hear about Eddie watching Downing as she was sleeping. Riley needed the jury to think that Eddie was the kind of kid who would walk into the house when Downing was home alone and watch her sleep. He was not. No way. That's what he told them at the start of the trial. Paul's story fit this theory and made Eddie O'Brien a creepy, voyeuristic kid. Nope. I do not buy that for $1. It was also suggested that this is precisely what Eddie O'Brien did just 3 hours later in order to commit an unspeakable and horrific crime. Bob George never asked Paul what direction Eddie had come from when he approached him at the car. He never asked Paul if he saw Eddie pass by him to walk into the house. He never pushed far enough to expose the impossibility of this conversation ever having taken place. According to Eddie, Paul was already off to Revere Beach with Janine when he walked back from Union Square. Eddie left the midnight convenience store at about 6:30. He stopped at Prospect Hill to park. He stopped at Prospect Hill Park to talk to some girls who were not from the neighborhood. After that, he walked up to Bigelow Street and down to Boston Street, where he saw his friends, Ryan, Joey, and Chris, walking in the Downing front door. He crossed Boston Street and joined them in the house. Eddie insists that this conversation, as described by Paul, simply never took place because he was not there. Much of Paul's testimony was either exaggerated or untruthful. George was able to show numerous inconsistencies in his testimony on cross-examination, including him saying that Eddie had never been inside the house or played video games in his house. George asked him if this was the way he wanted to leave it with the jury, that Eddie was the only boy in the entire group of Ryan's friends who he never saw inside his house. He responded, "Believe it or not, yeah." He is an awful, awful, awful lawyer. I can't with I need more coffee. I can't with this guy. I can't. I just can't. I'm so sad for Eddie O'Brien's family that they had to deal with this jabron. This is crazy. What? Did he mean believe it or not? I do want to leave it this way with the jury. Or, wait, hold on, let me start over. What? Did he mean believe it or not? I do want to leave it this way with the jury? Or did he mean believe it or not, Ed O'Brien never went into my house, even though he was with my brother, were friends since the day they were toddlers? Paul seemed to be challenging George to call him a liar. He was flippant, almost defiant in his misrepresentations. Why was he lying? What was the purpose? What did he gain? Was he being so blatant about it because he was uncomfortable with the lies, or because he didn't care about them? George moved on to Paul's statement that Eddie asked him every single Sunday about why his mother sat in the driveway smoking cigarettes in her car. Question: and why is Sunday locked in your mind as the day of the week that he was asking you about it? Answer: because that was the day I would come over to Janine, and I get her we had CCD classes in the morning, and he'd usually answer the door. Question: and that's when he would say that to you? Answer: yeah. Question: and CCD was and is what, Catholic education? Answer: yeah. Question: and that would be about what, 9 o'clock in the morning? Answer: yeah, about 10 o'clock. Question: well, you know that Eddie O'Brien worked at the midnight convenience store from 7 o'clock to noon. Answer: no, he'd get off early. The papers had to be done by, I think 7 o'clock in the morning. Again, what Paul said was simply not true. It could be proven false, and he just didn't care. The final confabulated testimony came when George questioned Paul about the previous Sunday, the week before his mother's murder. Paul testified that this was the day Eddie told him about seeing the woman undress in her window. Question: and the comments he made to you on that day, the Sunday before your mother's death, which would be the 16th of July, 1995, is that the day he told you that he saw a woman undressing across the street? Answer: yes. Question: and you remember that day specifically for what reason? Answer: because that was one of the first times I heard him ever talk about looking into someone else's window and describing what he saw. Question: and the reason you remember it was that Sunday is because that's the first time in the entire time you knew him that he said something like that? Answer: yeah, that vividly, yeah. Question: okay, and that's why you remember that Sunday? Answer: yes. Question: and what time was that? Answer: that was in the afternoon. Question: okay, and do you recall today? And I know it's hard to focus from before, but do you remember whether it was late afternoon or early afternoon? Answer: I think it was probably around 3 o'clock. Question: and where was that said to you? Answer: question: where were you two located? Excuse me. Answer: I was up on his porch. Question: was anyone else there? Answer: no. Question: was anyone else present in the house that day? Answer: other than Janine? Yeah, Janine was there. Question: well, if I told you that Edward O'Brien's grandfather's birthday party was that day, and there were almost 30 or 40 people there? Would that refresh your memory? Riley, objection. Judge McDaniel, sustained. The judge is filthy. I just can't. I cannot. This question is objectionable because the birthday party occurring on July 16th was not yet in evidence. No one had testified about it yet, and therefore the question assumes facts not in evidence. Did you see Edward O'Brien's grandfather there that day? Answer, no. Question, did you see any guests at a birthday party that day? Excuse me. Answer, do I remember any guests? No. Question, okay, so nothing was going on at the house at the time that you were there at about 3 o'clock that Sunday? Answer, not that I recall. By this time, Paul's credibility about anything he had asserted during his testimony was seriously questionable. In his zeal to shore up his assertions in the face of contradictory evidence, he became even more entrenched in his stories. He said that Eddie was just like a family member, one who apparently had never been in his house. George returned to the time during which the conversation with Eddie outside of his house supposedly took place. He asked Paul to tell the jury again what he did, step by step, after the boys put the groceries in the house. Paul started by restating that he went back into his house to put away the perishables. He stopped and thought for a minute, then said, and then we went, okay, wait, okay, I went, Janine, after I put the perishables away, Ed had already been dropped off because this is around 6 o'clock, around 6:45, and Janine called me. We went out after we directly went out. Paul failed to remember his alleged conversation with Eddie. In this version, he seemed to be trying to remember where Eddie was and determined that Eddie had been dropped off in Union Square. In this version, Paul went directly out from his house with Janine. There was no waiting against the car for Janine or knocking on the door. Paul's testimony continued on cross-examination with what happened when he returned from Revere Beach that evening. He said he and Janine returned home at 8 in order for Janine to switch cars with Michelle Cameron. The only reason he entered his house, he said, was because he was hungry. He got a saltine to eat and maybe a lollipop. He said he came right back out after about 3 minutes. When asked on direct examination, Paul said he came out between 8:20 and 8:30. That was the first contradiction. On direct examination, not even an hour before, Paul testified that he'd come out of his house and gone across the street to Ed's house. He said he stayed on the porch there for about 15 minutes. Paul is lying. On cross-examination, Paul testified that when he came out, he saw Ed Sr., Ed Jr., and John Roberts on the O'Brien front porch, but he didn't talk with them. He said that after leaving his house, he got in the back of Michelle Cameron's car and they left again for Revere Beach. That was the second contradiction. In fact, Paul, in addition to getting a saltine, can I just interject here? If you're hungry, does one saltine cracker do it for you? One saltine cracker and a lollipop? For real? If you're an ant, what? One saltine cracker and a lollipop? Like, come on. Okay. One saltine. I just can't. Okay. In fact, Paul, in addition to getting a saltine, emerged with a backpack when he left his house at 8:20 or 8:30. He threw the backpack in Michelle's trunk before they left. After the murder, the police had seemed to be well aware of the backpack. They had questioned Janine O'Brien about it extensively, wanting to know where it was and if he had towels in it. Janine didn't know the answer to either of those questions. The police went to Michelle Cameron's house to retrieve it from her vehicle. It was later sent for forensic testing along with Paul's sneakers, an Orlando Magic t-shirt, and a knife. So Paul had a backpack with a t-shirt, sneakers, and a knife. Paul, Janet Downing's son, a different person who was never tried, this is mental. What follows is a drawing made by Robert Pino the crime scene chemist from the state police lab who collected and numbered all the evidence related to Downing's fatal stabbing. What is most curious about this forensic drawing is that the only item on it that contains notations about where, when, and by whom it was found is the knife. The notations suggest that the knife was found 3 days after the backpack was seized. If this knife was not found with the backpack and other items of Paul's, why was it delivered to the lab with Paul's backpack? Good Lord. Why is it included in this drawing with his items that were to be tested? Why don't the sneakers, shirt, and backpack contain notations about where and when they were found and who confiscated them? According to the lab report, no blood was found on any of the items. For the first time at the trial during George's cross-examination of Paul, the family dog was mentioned. That Downing's had a golden retriever that barked at everything, according to Virginia Reckley. The neighbor who shared a common wall with the Downings, Virginia noted that she did not hear the dog bark at all on the night of Downing's murder, yet the dog was found beside Downing's lifeless body. When the first police officer arrived at the scene, George asked Paul where the dog was when he went in the house at 8. He said the dog was on the main floor where the living room was. Kitchen and den were located. Paul insisted he never went near the stairs between 8 and 8:20 or 8:30, and that everything in the house at that point was normal. Question, where was your mother? Answer, she was still alive on the couch sleeping. You buy that, I'm going to sell you a bridge. Interesting answer to that question. Where's your mother? Answer, she was still alive. I find that odd too. Paul nevertheless said he didn't talk with his mother or interact with the dog, so how did he know she was still alive? Right, how do you know she's still alive? She's on the couch. She looks like she's sleeping. She could have been dead on the couch. How do you know? He said the lights were off in the downstairs rooms, and it was just becoming dark out. Would Paul's inconsistent, exaggerated, and fabricated testimony affect how the jury considered him and his actions on the night of the murder? Would they wonder if he had also not told the truth about what happened in the house at 8:15 when Virginia Reckley heard the loud noise? Would they wonder where the dog was while Downing was being attacked? Would they wonder why no one heard the dog barking, even with all the windows open on that hot night? Would they consider that possibility that the dog may not have barked if Downing's attacker was not a stranger? Good Lord. All right, you're not going to be able to see this picture very well, but I'm going to hold it here anyways. Hopefully you can see some of it. This is the top. There's that. There's that. The knife is crazy. It's crazy. That's crazy. I cannot. I'm telling you, this book, I just cannot. And this is why I've been drinking coffee. I drink tea. You people know me. I drink tea. When do I drink coffee? Never. Coffee. And fancy coffee. Fancy caramel, fruity tooty bullshit. I don't know. Coffee. Okay. Chapter 25. Where did I start? I gotta go back to where I started. I started here on 23. I started on 23. Do that. Okay. I think I started on FUBAR. Yeah, I started on FUBAR. Just do that. Okay. Okay. Chapter 25. 25? 25? Do you see? Even the coffee is not helping. The caffeine is not helping. This book is like doing things to my head. Here we go. Edgemon. That's a great name too, Edgemon. Hello. Sorry that I missed you. I'm so like headfirst in this book that I apologize if I missed saying hello to anybody. Chapter 25, day 6 continued. Joey Dion was one of the Ryan Downing Eddie O'Brien group. He'd met Eddie when he was 10 years old. He was 16 in 1995, about a year older than Eddie. Joey was, by the time of the trial, a student at Boston School of Art. He told the jury that all the boys wandered wondered why Janet Downing had the habit of sitting in her car. It wasn't only Eddie who commented on this. He could remember only one comment Eddie made about Janet Downing's relationship with her best friend, Jean McGarry. But it was like joking around. The comment was made quite some time before the murder. Joey testified that on July 23, 1995, the day of the murder, Joey was at Ryan's house playing Sega Genesis. Oh, I remember that. In the den during the afternoon. At some point, Downing came home with the groceries. Joey and Ryan helped bring the bags of groceries into the kitchen. Eddie was not there at that time. They left to meet Chris Ford at the Tower, a park at the end of Biglow Street where the kids hung out, and the three returned to 71 Boston Street about 100 yards away. They stayed outside for a few minutes, then entered the Downing house, and while they were going in, Eddie came from across the street into the house with them. The boys hung out in the kitchen for a while, discussing possible plans for the evening. Joey said this group of boys had been in the Downing home countless times together. Joey and Eddie went into the den to play Sega Genesis. As Joey followed him in, Eddie came back out. Someone, he couldn't remember who, asked where Ryan's mom was, and Eddie told them that Ryan's mother was sleeping on the couch in the den. It was why he and Joey couldn't play the video games. The boys stayed in the kitchen and decided to go swimming at a friend's house. They all left, but Eddie went home. Joey said it was not unusual for Eddie not to go swimming with them, quote, because usually when we went swimming at a pool, a public pool or anywhere else, he wouldn't go. I don't know why, but it was like surprising. Riley's theory was that Eddie didn't go with them because he was already planning to murder Ryan's mother while the others were swimming. No, he was a bigger boy. He was chubby. He had issues with his body and he didn't want to go swimming and take off his shirt in front of other people. I totally get that. I used to be the fat kid. I never wanted to go swimming in front of people. I totally get that. When asked what Eddie was wearing that night at 7:50, Joey said he had on a striped polo shirt. Oh, disclaimer, polo's in the bag. He had on a striped polo shirt with a collar and dark green shorts. Each of these boys remembered a different kind of shirt. Only one remembered that it was a white Nike over-the-rim shirt. This is not uncommon with eyewitnesses' testimony, which is notoriously unreliable. On cross-examination, George questioned Joey about the house where a woman named Mrs. Kenny lived. Mrs. Kenny was an elderly neighbor with a huge rundown Victorian house. The kids and the adults in the neighborhood all called it the Boo Radley house, after the reclusive neighborhood character in To Kill a Mockingbird, and wondered what it looked like inside. Oddly enough, George had gotten Paul's testimony regarding Mrs. Kenny's house stricken from the record, yet he continued to reintroduce the subject with subsequent witnesses. Ryan Downing followed Joey Dion on the witness stand. Ryan had been the family member most interviewed by police, and he testified at 3 proceedings: the grand jury, the first transfer hearing, and at the trial. Ryan was now 19 and a freshman at Bunker Hill Community College, living with his father and stepmother. Ryan named the same group of friends, Marco Abreu, Joey Dion, Chris Ford, and Garvey Solomon, as being very good friends. He added that as for Eddie, we're like best friends. His mother and his friends had a mutually respectful relationship, he said. Eddie occasionally asked him questions like why his mother parked in the driveway a lot when she came home from work, and had commented on her cooking. He testified that Eddie said Ryan's mom's cooking tasted bad and said they shouldn't eat at her house. This made Ryan angry. He asked Eddie if he didn't like his mom, but Eddie said he did like Ryan's mom. So far, the evidence was not painting a picture of a boy so clearly obsessed with his friend's mother that he was compelled to murder her. These single comments Eddie made about Downing's friend and her cooking sounded like nothing more than what 2 15-year-old kids might say to each other. Even adding more questions about why Downing sat in her car in the driveway so much didn't make this any more than adolescent banter. Riley knew he was in trouble. Paul's testimony had been so over the top as to raise serious credibility questions, and Ryan was not giving Riley the answers he was looking for. After the lunch break, Ryan's testimony changed. Riley began to elicit testimony about a conversation that Ryan and Eddie allegedly had on the night before the murder. Ryan had never mentioned this conversation in his testimony to the grand jury in August. It was not mentioned in any of his 3 interviews with the police, 5 months later, at the first transfer hearing in January 1996, Ryan testifies about this for the first time. Answer: we were just making plans for the next day, and then he asked me, before I left, he said that he'd never seen me angry, ready to hurt somebody. And I told him that I'm not like that. I don't get mad very easily. Then he said, there's only one time I recall you being angry, and that was when we were little. And he said something to me like, and you chased me. And he said, but since then, he's never seen me like really hurt somebody. And I told him that I'm not like that. Question: did he ask you if you ever felt like hurting someone? Answer: yes. He said, did I feel like hurting somebody? And I said, I'm not like that. Did he ask you if you ever felt like hurting someone? Is that a question that suggests the answer Riley wants Ryan to give him? It's a leading question and not permissible. He is literally putting words in Ryan's mouth because the only possible answers are either yes or no. George should have, but did not object to this question. George, you are not doing your job. Sorry. Good Lord. I can't. Here we go. Oh, here we go. Answer. And we just started talking. We were just talking about what to do the next day, and he asked me if I wanted to play basketball, and after he gets out of work, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Excuse me. And then he asked me a question if I ever wanted to hurt somebody, and I said no, I really didn't. And he said, well, I remember one time you did. It was when I was little, and he made a comment about me being kept back, and I chased him around a car, and he said that was the only time I really felt like that was the only really time I ever saw you really want to hurt someone, like a person when they hurt somebody like this. And then I said, I'm not like that. I don't get angry. And that was it. Question: can you describe for the jury what he said about hurting someone, how he was acting? Answer: like conscious, like just, and sort of like wanting to hurt somebody. It was obvious that Ryan had been all well prepared about what he was going to tell the jury. He was having a great deal of trouble doing it, however, his tentative wording of sort of and like, showing that he was either uncomfortable with what he was expected to say or he couldn't remember what he was supposed to say. He did not know how to imply that Eddie was saying that Eddie was thinking about hurting someone. Riley asked about how Eddie acted, and Ryan said he acted like conscious and sort of like wanting to hurt somebody. Sort of like wanting to hurt somebody is vague, nondescript, and contrived. Riley moved on to the night of July 23rd. Ryan said Paul wasn't home when he and Joey came back from the tower with Chris Ford. Ryan, Chris, Joey, and Eddie all went into the Downing kitchen and were hanging out. Joey and Ed kind of drifted off into the TV room and then came back. Chris Ford asked where Ryan's mom was. And that's when Eddie responded. She was asleep in the den. It was at this point that Eddie went out onto the back deck and got locked out of the house. George was successful in cross-examination in clarifying that Eddie only made one comment about Ryan's mother, and Jean McGarry, and that he never mentioned it again. He made only one comment about Ryan's mother's cooking, and he never made fun of her cooking again. Ryan testified that Eddie was not angry during any of these exchanges. Since Ryan first knew Eddie when he was a toddler, he said Eddie was always respectful and never angry towards Ryan's mother. George questioned him about the conversation on the night before his mother died. Question: how did the conversation turn from basketball to the time that he chased you around the car for? Answer: question: teasing you. How did it turn in that direction? Answer: he just stated, he broke up the question. That will do it. And I was I was trying to understand what he was talking about. Then he specified with the story. Question: and is it fair for me to say that the incident he's talking about was a result of Eddie teasing you at the time for you staying back in the first grade? Answer: yes. Question: did he say anything after that? Answer: no, I don't think so. This account is much clearer than the one he gave on direct examination, yet Ryan said that the topic came up when Eddie brought up the question. He doesn't say what the question was. Ryan was struggling with this new version of events. Instead of saying he asked me, he said he brought up the question. That was the best George could do with Ryan's statement, even though Ryan couldn't articulate how Eddie brought up the question. Out of the blue, as Riley had said in his opening statement, he had successfully suggested that the night before the murder, Eddie O'Brien was thinking about wanting to hurt someone. The final witness for this long day of patchwork testimony was Chris Ford. Chris was now 18 and attending art school in Boston. He testified that Janet Downing treated all of Ryan's friends equally and with respect. They, in return, liked and respected her. Riley asked if Chris was present when Eddie asked Ryan if his mother was a lesbian. He testified that he was, and that he never heard Eddie mention that again. Chris said he'd met Joey Dion and Ryan Downing at Bigelow Street sometime after 6:30 on July 23rd, and they rollerbladed Ryan, biked Joey, and walked Chris to the Downing home down on Bigelow Street. Chris also did not see Paul Downing either, inside or outside the house, when they returned from the park. As they were walking up to Ryan's pathway to the house, Eddie came from across Boston Street and joined them. They all went into the kitchen. Eddie and Joey wandered away for a minute. Chris asked Ryan where his mother was because he wanted to tell a story with a swear word, and he didn't want to swear in front of her. That's cute. Eddie responded that she was in the den sleeping on the couch. He and Joey Dion had gone in there to play Sega and noticed she was sleeping and returned to the kitchen. They left the house to go swimming. He next saw Eddie at midnight convenience store at about 10:15 p.m. Chris stated that Ed was wearing a dark striped polo-style shirt, 3 buttons and a collar, dark shorts, and black sneakers. At the Downing home earlier in the Union Square, sorry, MS, can't help it. In Union Square, he was wearing an inside-out white Nike over-the-rim t-shirt. But, Chris testified, his shorts and sneakers were the same as appeared in the police photograph of Eddie that Riley showed the witness. There would be 4 more of Eddie O'Brien's friends testifying the following day. So far, with the exception of Paul and Ryan Downing, Eddie's friends were proving to be kids who were trying to tell the jury the truth about him. Ryan appeared to be struggling between... Sorry, I lost my place. Sorry, I have a hamster that just moved and scared the crap out of me, so I need to turn to see it. There you go. Ryan appeared to be struggling between his own memories and how the district attorney wanted him to present his recollection to the jury. Paul, on the other hand, was a wild card, prepared and going beyond what was expected or needed. His young age and inexperience betrayed him in the end. And he couldn't remember what he'd said before, resulting in a total contradictory testimony. That's crazy. That's crazy. Chapter 26, Lobby Conference Rulings. I'm going to pause right here. That's crazy. This book is... We're going to stop here at 26. I'm going to take a breather. I'm going to come back. I'll read some more. But this is a banana sandwich, this book. There's no way that Eddie, in my opinion, there's no way that Eddie did this. My money's on either Paul or Artie, or the two of them together. I can't. I just can't. I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to upload this. I'll come back with a little bit more. But I need to take a break. Good Lord, I shall return.